You're watching another True Villain commentary.
Alright everybody, it's True Villain. Welcome back. And today I want to talk about something that looks worse the more you think about it. Was Sony buying Bungie actually worth it? Because when this deal happened back in 2022, the idea sounded huge. Sony was paying $3.6 billion for one of the biggest names in shooters, the studio behind Destiny and the original Halo. And the whole pitch was that Bungie was going to help PlayStation level up in live service, not just with games, but with technology, systems, and operating knowledge. Sony literally said the acquisition would give PlayStation access to Bungie's world-class approach to live game services and technology expertise, while Bungie would stay independent and keep publishing across platforms. That was the dream. Sony wasn't just buying a studio. Sony was buying know-how. Sony was buying a shortcut into the live service future. Sony was buying a team that supposedly knew how to keep players engaged for years. And now, here we are in 2026, and the conversation looks a whole lot uglier. Because Sony's own FY 2025 financial results say it recorded 120.1 yuan billion in impairment losses against Bungie's intangible and other assets, plus 18.3 yuan billion in expenses from correcting previously capitalized development costs. Sony CFO Lin Tao also said Bungie's title portfolio did not reach expectations. Sony downwardly revised its business plan and impaired the fixed assets related to Bungie except for goodwill. That's not random internet drama. That's Sony telling investors the deal is not performing the way they hoped. And in plain English, that is bad. Very bad. Because once a company starts taking impairment charges that size, it means the value they thought they were getting is no longer lining up with reality. It does not mean Sony literally lit $765 million in cash on fire overnight. But it does mean Sony looked at Bungie related assets and said, yeah, this is worth less than we thought. That is exactly the kind of headline you do not want tied to a studio you bought for $3.6 billion. Now, to be fair, this is where I think you have to separate short-term scorecard from long-term strategy. If the question is, does this acquisition look worth it today, right now, based on the public numbers? My answer is no. I do not think you can honestly look at a $3.6 billion acquisition, then look at Sony writing down 120.1 yuan billion in Bungie related asset value. Look at the earlier comments about Destiny 2 not reaching expectations, and then say, yeah, this is going great. That would just be cope. Reuters reported back in late 2025 that Sony's CFO said user engagement had not met expectations after the acquisition, and then Sony's latest annual results hit even harder after that. That is a brutal sequence. And honestly, this is the problem with live service acquisitions in general. They look smart when you're buying the idea of a studio. They look a lot less smart when you're stuck owning the execution of that studio. Because Sony did not buy Bungie just to admire the legacy. It bought Bungie because Bungie was supposed to be a major part of Sony's push into live service games. Around that same period, Sony was openly talking about launching a large slate of live service titles and spending a much bigger share of its PlayStation Studios budget there. Bungie was supposed to help drive that future. But instead, what has the public story become? Destiny 2 underperformed relative to Sony's expectations. Marathon has clearly not been enough to stop Sony from marking Bungie down hard. Bungie itself has gone through leadership and restructuring turbulence, including Pete Parsons stepping down in 2025. That is not the profile of an acquisition that is obviously paying off. Now, I do think there is one argument in Sony's favor here, and it's the only argument that keeps me from calling this a completely dead deal forever. And that argument is this. The acquisition still might have strategic value that hasn't fully shown up in the public score yet, because when Sony bought Bungie, it was not just buying one or two games. It was buying process, pipeline knowledge, back-end live service expertise, technology, and people who had operated one of the most durable console-first live service franchises in the industry. Even if Bungie's own output has disappointed financially, there is still a possibility that Sony believes the studio's internal value to PlayStation Studios is larger than what the public sees from Destiny 2 or Marathon alone. That was part of the acquisition logic Sony laid out from day one. But here's the issue. That value has to show up somewhere eventually. It has to show up in better PlayStation live service execution. It has to show up in better launches. It has to show up in stronger retention systems. It has to show up in better game operations. It has to show up in hits. Because if it never shows up publicly, then the hidden strategic value argument just becomes a polite way of saying, well, maybe it'll make sense later. And that's not enough for a $3.6 billion purchase. That's why I think the honest answer is pretty simple. Sony buying Bungie might still make sense someday, but it does not look worth it right now. That's the key distinction. I am not saying the deal can never recover. I am not saying Bungie can never deliver something meaningful again. I am not saying Sony got absolutely nothing, but I am saying that when the company itself is writing the asset value down and publicly admitting the portfolio did not meet expectations, the burden of proof shifts hard. Now it is on Sony and Bungie to prove this acquisition was more than just an expensive bet on a studio whose best days were already behind it. And if I'm being even more blunt, this looks like one of those acquisitions where the timing may have been the biggest mistake. Because Sony bought Bungie when the industry was still obsessed with live service scale, platform ecosystems, and buying expertise instead of building it internally, a lot of companies were chasing that exact kind of logic around that time. But now that the live service space is way more crowded, way more expensive, and way more unforgiving, the price tag looks way crazier in hindsight. Sony may have bought Bungie at exactly the moment the market story around just buy a live service expert was already getting weaker. That's my analysis, but it fits the public strategy context around the deal. So where do I land overall? If you ask me, was it worth it right now? No, I do not think so. A $3.6 billion studio buy that has already led to major impairment losses, disappointing portfolio performance, and public admissions that expectations were missed is not a win. That is the scoreboard. If you ask me, can it still become worth it eventually? Maybe, but for that to happen, Bungie has to become more than a cautionary tale. Sony needs either a real turnaround in Bungie's output, real visible value flowing into PlayStation's broader live service efforts, or ideally both. Until then, this deal looks a lot more like buyer's remorse than smart long-term vision. If you've got thoughts on whether Sony's Bungie deal can still be saved, or if it already looks like one of gaming's biggest recent mistakes, drop it in the comments. And if you're new around here, subscribe. See you guys in the next video.